I was sitting on the couch, grading papers from my high school English class, when the emergency alert hit. The TV screen went black, and a harsh red logo flashed across it. The voice that followed was calm, too calm, like it was trying to mask the panic underneath. This is an emergency alert. A severe weather event is imminent. Residents within the following areas are advised to seek immediate shelter, all of Black Hollow County. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The storm system approaching is classified as an unclassified atmospheric anomaly. Extreme winds and hazardous conditions are expected. Seek shelter immediately. Do not go outside. Do not attempt to travel. Stay indoors until further notice. The message repeated once, and then the screen went silent. The TV didn't return to normal programming. Instead, it stayed black, as if the storm had already swallowed the signal. I sat there for a moment, frozen. Unclassified atmospheric anomaly? That wasn't something you heard in a weather report. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up with the same alert. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and saw texts from my sister, Emily, who lived a few towns over. "Did you get the alert? Are you okay?" I typed back quickly, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just staying inside. You?" Her reply came a second later. "Same. Be careful. Love you." I stared at the screen, my throat tight. Emily and I had always been close, especially after our parents died. She was the only family I had left, and the thought of something happening to her, or to me, made my chest ache. The wind started then, low and distant at first, like the hum of an engine. But within minutes, it grew louder, more insistent. The windows rattled in their frames, and the trees outside swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky. I could feel the pressure in the air change, like the storm was sucking the oxygen out of the room. I moved to the window, peering out through the blinds. The sky was a sickly green, the kind of color you only see in movies before a tornado hits. The wind was howling now, a sound that didn't seem natural. It wasn't just wind, it was a voice, low and guttural, like it was trying to say something. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent a chill down my spine. My phone buzzed again. Another alert. Reminder: do not go outside. The storm is now entering Black Hollow County. Winds are intensifying. Stay indoors. Stay away from windows. Do not attempt to leave your home. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The wind was so loud now that it drowned out everything else. I could feel the house shaking, the walls creaking under the strain. I grabbed a blanket and huddled on the couch, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The wind wasn't just outside. It was everywhere, like it was inside my head, whispering things I couldn't understand. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind. But then I heard something else, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. It was coming from the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then I saw it. Something was moving outside the window, something dark and shapeless, pressed against the glass. It wasn't a tree branch. It was too big, too deliberate. It moved like it was alive. I scrambled off the couch, my mind racing. The emergency alert had said to stay inside, but what if whatever was out there could get in? I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The call didn't go through. The screen showed no signal, just the emergency alert logo staring back at me. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then the wind roared again, louder than ever. The house groaned, and I heard something crack, a tree branch maybe, or part of the roof. I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. I had to get somewhere safer, somewhere the wind couldn't reach me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement, my heart pounding with every step. The wind was still howling, but down here it was quieter, muffled by the thick concrete walls. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold stone, and tried to steady my breathing. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die. But it stayed on, casting a weak, shaky light around the room. I didn't know how long I sat there listening to the storm rage outside. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. All that mattered was the wind, the darkness, and the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The basement was cold, colder than it should have been. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, but it didn't help. The chill wasn't just in the air, it was in my bones, like the storm had seeped into the house and was slowly freezing me from the inside out. The flashlight's beam flickered again, and I shook it, willing it to stay on. It was the only light I had, and without it, the darkness felt alive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The wind was still howling upstairs, but down here, it was different. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry, hungry, and it was getting closer. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't work. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head, like the storm had found a way in. I could feel it, a pressure building behind my eyes, pushing against my skull. I closed my eyes, but the darkness only made it worse. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then I heard it. A single word, clear as day. "Run!" My eyes snapped open. The flashlight's beam was shaking, not because of the storm, but because my hands were trembling. I didn't know if the voice was real or if I was losing my mind, but it didn't matter. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and made my way to the far corner of the basement. There was an old storage closet there, filled with boxes and tools. It wasn't much, but it was the only place I could think of that might offer some kind of protection. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, pulling it shut behind me. The space was cramped, barely big enough to stand in, but it felt safer than the open basement. At least here, the walls were close, and the darkness didn't feel quite so vast. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to steady my breathing. The whispers were still there, but they were quieter now, muffled by the walls of the closet. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of my own heartbeat, trying to drown out the storm. But then I heard something else. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the other side of the closet door. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, and then it stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then the door handle began to turn. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, just a crack, and a cold draft swept into the closet. I could feel it, icy and sharp, like the breath of something that shouldn't exist. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. The door opened wider, and I could see the faint outline of something standing in the doorway, a shadow darker than the darkness around it. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my lungs frozen. The shadow stepped into the closet, and I could feel it, a presence so heavy it seemed to crush the air out of the room. It wasn't a person, it wasn't anything I could describe. It was just darkness, alive and moving, reaching for me. And then the flashlight died. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I could feel the shadow closing in, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end, but it didn't come. Instead, I heard a voice, a real voice, not a whisper. "Hey, are you down here?" The shadow was gone. The pressure in the room lifted, and I could breathe again. I opened my eyes and saw a beam of light shining through the open closet door. Someone was standing there, holding a flashlight. "I heard you screaming," the voice said. "Are you okay?" I stumbled out of the closet, my legs still shaking. The person holding the flashlight was a man, maybe in his 30s, with a scruffy beard and a worried expression. He was wearing a raincoat, and his hair was wet, like he'd been outside. Who are you?" I managed to stammer. "Name's Tom," he said. "I live a few houses down. I saw your lights go out and thought you might need help." I didn't know what to say. I was still trying to process what had just happened, but Tom didn't seem to notice. He was already moving toward the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Come on," he said. "We need to get upstairs. It's not safe down here." I followed him, my mind racing. The whispers were gone, but the memory of the shadow was still fresh in my mind. I didn't know if Tom had seen it too, or if he even believed me, but I didn't care. Right now, he was the only thing standing between me and the storm. We reached the top of the stairs, and Tom pushed the door open. The wind hit us like a wall, cold and sharp, carrying with it the smell of rain and something else, something rotten. The house was dark, the windows rattling in their frames, and the sound of the storm was deafening. Tom turned to me, his face grim. "We need to get to the living room. It's the safest place in the house." I nodded, too shaken to argue. But as we moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and shifting in the corners of my vision. And the whispers. They were back, faint but unmistakable. "Run." The living room felt no safer than the basement. The wind was louder here, slamming against the windows like it was trying to break in. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic, like blood. Tom was pacing back and forth, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. He kept glancing at the windows, his jaw clenched tight. "We need to barricade the doors," he said, more to himself than to me. "If the wind gets any worse, it'll rip this place apart." I didn't argue. My mind was still reeling from what had happened in the basement, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still out there, waiting. I helped Tom drag the couch in front of the front door, then piled chairs and tables against the windows. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As we worked, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just in my head anymore, they were everywhere, echoing through the house like a chorus of voices. I could feel them, cold and sharp, brushing against my skin. I tried to ignore them, to focus on what Tom was saying, but it was impossible. The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside, in the walls, in the air, in my head. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Tom stopped what he was doing and looked at me. "Hear what?" "The whispers," I said. "They're everywhere. Can't you hear them?" He frowned, his flashlight beam flickering across my face. "I don't hear anything. Just the wind." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I'd heard. The whispers were real, and they were getting louder. I could feel them pressing in on me, like they were trying to tell me something. But what? Tom must have seen the fear in my eyes because he put a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, it's going to be okay. We just need to ride this out. The storm can't last forever." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was something else, something worse. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. We finished barricading the windows and sat down on the floor, our backs against the wall. The wind was still howling, but the whispers had quieted, at least for now. Tom handed me a bottle of water, and I drank it greedily, my throat dry and raw. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, breaking the silence. "A few years," I said. "You?" "My whole life," he said. "I've never seen anything like this before." The wind, it's not normal. It's like it's alive. I shivered, his words echoing my own thoughts. Do you think it's the storm? The one from the emergency alert? Tom shook his head. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's bad. Real bad. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. The wind was still raging, but there was something else now, a low, rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat. It was coming from outside, faint but unmistakable. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through the floor. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his face pale. Yeah, I hear it. We both stood up, our eyes fixed on the window. The thumping was getting louder, more insistent. And then I saw it, a shape moving in the darkness. It was hard to make out at first, just a blur of motion, but as it got closer, I could see it clearly. It was a person, or at least it looked like a person. They were walking toward the house, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were being pulled by an invisible force. Who the hell is that? Tom whispered, his flashlight beam flickering across the figure. I didn't answer. My throat was too tight to speak. The figure was close now, close enough that I could see their face. It was a man, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth hanging open like he was screaming. But there was no sound, just the thumping, growing louder with every step he took. We need to get out of here, Tom said, his voice urgent. Now! I didn't argue. We grabbed our flashlights and ran for the back door, but it was too late. The man was at the window now, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes staring right at us. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Instead, I heard the whispers again, louder than ever. Run. Tom yanked the back door open, and we stumbled outside, the wind slamming into us like a freight train. The rain was coming down in sheets, cold and oily, soaking through my clothes in seconds. I could barely see through the downpour, but I could hear the thumping, louder now, coming from all around us. This way! Tom shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the woods. We ran, our feet slipping in the mud, the wind tearing at our clothes. The thumping was everywhere, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my bones. I could feel it in my chest, like it was trying to pull me apart. And then I saw them. More figures, emerging from the trees. They were all the same, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. They were moving toward us, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were being pulled by the same invisible force. Keep moving! Tom shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. We ran, the figures closing in behind us. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices screaming in my head. I could feel them, cold and sharp, like knives cutting into my skin. And then I heard it, a single word, clear as day. Run. The woods were a blur of rain and shadows, the trees bending and groaning under the weight of the wind. Tom and I ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, the thumping sound growing louder with every step. The figures were still behind us, their movements slow but relentless, like they had all the time in the world. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them anymore. The whispers were everywhere, a cacophony of voices screaming in my head, urging me to run, to hide, to give up. Where are we going? I shouted, my voice barely audible over the storm. There's a shelter up ahead, Tom yelled back. An old storm cellar. We'll be safe there. I didn't ask how he knew about it. I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the figures, from the whispers, from the storm that seemed to be alive. We stumbled through the trees, our feet slipping in the mud, the rain stinging our faces. The thumping was so loud now that it felt like it was inside my head, pounding against my skull. And then I saw it, a small, rusted door set into the ground, half hidden by overgrown grass and fallen branches. Tom dropped to his knees and started pulling at the branches, his hands shaking. I joined him, my fingers numb from the cold, and together we managed to clear the door. Tom grabbed the handle and yanked it open, revealing a set of narrow, rickety stairs leading down into darkness. "Go!" he shouted, pushing me toward the stairs. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled down the stairs, my hands gripping the cold, damp walls for balance. Tom followed close behind, pulling the door shut behind us. The sound of the storm was muffled down here, but the thumping was still there, vibrating through the ground, through the walls, through my body. Tom flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The storm cellar was small and cramped, with a dirt floor and walls made of rough stone. There were a few old shelves stacked with jars of preserves and cans of food, but otherwise, it was empty. It smelt damp and musty, like it hadn't been used in years. "We'll be safe here," Tom said, his voice shaky. "The storm can't get to us down here." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, and the thumping was growing louder. I could feel it in my chest, like it was trying to pull me apart. "What is that sound?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's like a heartbeat." Tom didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his face pale, his flashlight beam flickering across the rusted metal. The thumping was coming from above us now, like something was walking on the roof of the cellar. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. And then, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then the door began to rattle. It started slowly, just a faint trembling, but it grew louder and more violent with every second. The hinges groaned, and the metal buckled, like something was trying to force its way in. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Tom didn't answer. He was backing away from the door, his flashlight beam shaking. The rattling grew louder, and then I heard it. A voice coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in." My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my eyes fixed on the door. The voice wasn't human. It was too deep, too rough, like it was coming from something much bigger, much older. The door rattled again, and I could see the metal bending, the hinges straining under the pressure. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice urgent. "How?" I asked, my voice shaking. "There's no other way out." Tom didn't answer. He was already moving, his flashlight beam scanning the walls of the cellar. He stopped at the far corner, where the stone wall was cracked and crumbling. He grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the wall and started digging, his movements frantic. "Help me!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the door rattling. I didn't argue. I grabbed a pickaxe from the shelf and joined him, my hands shaking as I swung it into the wall. The stone was old and brittle, and it crumbled easily under the force of the pickaxe. The thumping was louder now, vibrating through the ground, through the walls, through my body. I could feel it in my chest, like it was trying to pull me apart. And then the door burst open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept digging, my hands bleeding, my arms aching, until the wall gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel leading into the darkness. Tom grabbed my arm and pulled me through, his flashlight beam flickering as we stumbled into the tunnel. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls slick with moisture. Tom and I ran, our footsteps echoing in the darkness, the thumping sound growing louder with every step. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. I could feel the whispers again, faint but insistent, like they were trying to tell me something. But I couldn't make out the words, not over the sound of the thumping, over the voice that was still echoing in my head. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning like a maze. I didn't know where we were going, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the storm, from the figures, from the thing that was chasing us. My lungs were burning, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber. The air was colder here, the walls lined with jagged rocks that glistened in the flashlight beam. In the center of the chamber was a large circular pit, its edges smooth and worn, like it had been carved by hand. The thumping was coming from the pit, loud and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. Tom didn't answer. He was staring at the pit, his face pale, his flashlight beam flickering across the smooth stone. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the pit. It was the man from before, the one who had been walking toward the house. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. He was standing perfectly still, his arms hanging limply at his sides, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice urgent. "Now!" But before we could move, the man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at us. He just walked straight into the pit, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. The thumping grew louder, more intense. And then I saw something rising from the pit, a shape, dark and shapeless, like a shadow given form. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could describe. It was just darkness, alive and moving, reaching for us. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices screaming in my head, urging me to run, to hide, to give up. "Run!" Tom shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the tunnel. We ran, the darkness closing in behind us. We stumbled out of the tunnel and into the woods, the rain still coming down in sheets. The wind was howling, the trees bending and groaning under its weight. The thumping was still there, but it was fading now, like the storm was losing its strength. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Tom and I collapsed on the ground, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The storm was still raging around us, but it felt different now, less alive, less angry. The thumping was gone, replaced by the sound of the wind and the rain. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Tom didn't answer. He was staring at the ground, his face pale, his hands shaking. I didn't press him. I didn't want to know. All that mattered was that we were alive, that we had survived. The storm lasted for hours, but it was different now. Just wind and rain, nothing more. The whispers were gone, the thumping was gone, and the figures were gone. By the time the sun rose, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt quieter, emptier, like something had been taken from it. Tom and I didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. We both knew that the storm wasn't just a storm. It was something else, something worse. And we both knew that it wasn't over. The storm would come back, and when it did, we wouldn't be ready. But for now, we were safe. For now, that was enough.